There is a moment most people know well, even if they have never named it out loud. You are about to speak in a meeting, or walk into a party where you only know one person, or post something you actually care about online. And before you do any of it, before you even open your mouth, a quiet voice in your head runs through the same checklist it always does. Will they think I am smart enough, funny enough, competent, or will they see right through me and find whatever it is I've been trying to hide? Brené Brown spent the better part of 2 decades studying that moment, not theorizing about it from a distance, but sitting with real people, collecting real stories, and asking a question that turned out to be more unsettling than anyone expected. The question was simple: what is it you're most afraid people will see? The answers were not simple at all. What Brown found over and over was that the fear of being judged is not really about other people. It is about what we believe we deserve. It is about whether we have quietly decided somewhere along the way that we are just a little too much or not quite enough. That is the thing worth examining. Not how to seem more confident in social situations, but why we stopped believing we were allowed to show up as ourselves in the first place. Here is what most advice about social anxiety gets wrong. It treats the fear as a performance problem. If you could just learn the right body language, the right conversational openers, the right way to walk into a room, the anxiety would fade. You would become someone who appears unafraid, and eventually maybe you would stop being afraid. Brené Brown disagrees with that framing entirely. Her research, rooted in thousands of interviews conducted over more than 2 decades at the University of Houston, kept returning to the same finding. The people who suffered least from social anxiety were not the ones who had mastered presentation. They were the ones who had made a different kind of peace, not with how they appeared, but with who they actually were. The word Brown uses for what those people had in common is vulnerability, and she is very precise about what she means by it. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is not oversharing. It is not performing emotion for an audience. Vulnerability, in Brown's framing, is the willingness to be seen without the guarantee of how that will land. That is a small distinction with very large consequences. What you are about to hear is not a list of social skills. It is closer to an argument that the very thing most people believe makes social anxiety worse is, in fact, the only thing that reliably makes it better. Point 1, the armor that makes you more afraid. Brown has a concept she calls the armor. It refers to all the ways human beings protect themselves from the possibility of judgment, sarcasm, cynicism, people-pleasing, over-preparing, staying quiet when you have something to say, laughing at yourself before anyone else can. Most people wear some version of this, and most people believe it is working. The armor is doing its job. It keeps them safe. What Brown found is that the armor does something else too. It keeps you perpetually on guard. When you are always managing how you appear, you never actually arrive anywhere. You are always just outside the room, checking the mirror one more time. There is a story Brown tells about a woman she interviewed who described herself as someone who never cried in public, never asked for help, and never admitted when she was out of her depth at work. This woman was effective. She was respected. She was also, by her own account, profoundly lonely, and she could not understand why. Brown's read on it was direct. When you do not let people see the real version of you, you cannot actually be loved by them. What they are loving is the performance, and some part of you knows that, which makes everything feel less safe, not more. The practical takeaway here is not to strip off all the armor at once. Brown never recommends that. What she suggests is noticing when the armor comes on, not judging it, just noticing. You were about to say something honest and then you deflected with a joke. You needed help and said you were fine. These are the moments worth tracking. Point 2, belonging is not the same thing as fitting in. This is one of the distinctions Brown draws that tends to stop people cold the first time they hear it. Fitting in, she argues, is the performance of belonging. You assess the room, figure out who people want you to be, and you become that version of yourself. You suppress what does not fit. You amplify what does. You get included and you get to stay, but you are not actually there. Not really. Belonging in Brown's framework is something different. It requires showing up as you are with no guarantee that the room will welcome what it gets. It is riskier. It is also the only version that actually satisfies the things social anxiety is supposedly afraid of losing. Brown traces this distinction back to a question she posed to hundreds of middle school students, a group with a famously low tolerance for anything that does not fit the social norm. She asked them to describe the difference between belonging and fitting in. Their answers were remarkable for their precision. One girl said, "Fitting in is when you change who you are. Belonging is when someone likes who you already are." A 12-year-old said that. The reason social anxiety escalates in many people over time is not because their social skills are deteriorating. It is because they have been fitting in for so long and working so hard at it that they have lost track of what belonging would even feel like. The anxiety becomes the signal that something real is being left out. The practical work here is deceptively simple. In your next social interaction, say one true thing. It does not need to be a confession. It does not need to be dramatic. Just one thing that is actually what you think, rather than what reads as safe. Notice what happens. Point 3, courage is the practice, not the outcome. There is a version of the conversation about social anxiety that ends here. Identify your fear, lean into vulnerability, and the anxiety goes away. Brown is careful not to promise that. What she says instead is that courage is not the absence of fear. It is taking the step while the fear is still there, and the more you practice taking that step, the less the fear gets to determine the whole shape of your life. Brown has written about her own experience with this directly. She describes herself not as someone who found vulnerability easy, but as someone who found the cost of avoiding it unbearable. There is a difference. The first version is about having overcome something. The second is about choosing repeatedly to keep going in spite of it. She points to what she calls the arena, a reference to Theodore Roosevelt's famous speech, about the man who is actually in the fight, rather than the critic watching from the seats. Brown's interpretation is that choosing to show up in any context where being seen as possible is an act that puts you in the arena. You will not always land well. You will sometimes be wrong, and people will sometimes not respond the way you hoped. But the person in the arena is changed by being there. The critic in the stands is not. The practical takeaway on this point is a reframe. If you are in a social situation and you feel afraid, that fear is not evidence that something bad is about to happen. It is often evidence that something real is at stake. Those are not the same thing. One calls for retreat. The other calls for steadiness. There is a test Brené Brown describes that she applies to the question of whether she is living by her own values. She asks herself, am I choosing comfort over courage right now? Not as a judgment, just as a question. The fear of being judged is at its core a comfort-seeking behavior. It makes sense. The world can be unkind. People can be dismissive. Judgment is real and it lands. But the long-term cost of organizing your life around the avoidance of judgment is not safety. It is a slow narrowing. The things you say get safer. The risks you take get smaller. The version of yourself that shows up in public gets further and further from the one that actually exists. Brown spent years studying what she calls wholehearted living, her term for the quality of engagement she observed in people who reported genuine connection and resilience. What those people shared was not an absence of fear. They were afraid. They just had a different relationship with it. They had decided somewhere that being seen was worth the risk of not being fully accepted. That is not a technique. It is a decision. One you can make again tomorrow and the day after that. You do not have to be fearless. You just have to decide that you are worth showing up for. If something in this video landed for you, the simplest thing you can do is hit subscribe so we can keep having these conversations. And leave a comment below with this. When is the last time you chose courage over comfort in a social situation? What happened? Reading those answers is one of the better parts of making this channel. We would love to hear yours. This channel is not affiliated with Brené Brown or any of her official representatives. The content you just watched is educational in nature, inspired by the publicly available teachings, writings, and interviews of Brené Brown. It does not constitute professional advice. Before making any major decision in this area, Please do your own research and consult a qualified professional.